All right, we'd like to call the American Eel Board to order. I'm Marty Gary, your chairman for the American Eel Board. Seated to my right is Kirby Roots-Murdy, who will be back in a moment. He's the Senior Fishery Management Plan Coordinator and Liaison for this species. Our vice chairman is Lynn Fagley from the state of Maryland. Before we get going, I'd just like to, I know it's been said before, and it'll be said many, many times before our meeting week is over with, but I want to thank the New Hampshire delegation, Doug Grouch, Cherie Patterson, Richie, and Dennis Abbott for their hospitality and all the work they put into to bring us together under this great venue and what's been a great meeting so far and will be a wonderful meeting for the rest of the week. So thank you to the New Hampshire delegation. And also thanks to Bob, Tony, and all the ASMFC staff for all the hard work that they've done to put us in a position to succeed in our meeting. So thank you very much, ASMFC staff. And I know, Tony, you'd like to say a couple words.
Thanks, Marty. I just wanted to introduce the Commission's newest staff member, Maya Dreswicki. She's right up here at the front of the table with Dustin, and she is the new Fisheries Administrative Assistant. She helps out both the ISFMP, the Science Department, and ACCSP as well at times, so she's getting to know all the parts of ASMFC. So if you see her around, please welcome her to the family.
All right, excellent. So our first order of business is approval of the agenda. Note that there's no aquaculture plan proposals on the agenda today, so should make things easier. So are there any changes or modifications to the agenda? Seeing none, we'll consider that approved. Next order of business is to approve the proceedings from the August 2019 meeting. Are there any modifications, changes to those proceedings? Seeing none, we'll consider those approved. Next order of business is public comment. I didn't see anybody signed up, but is there anyone in the public that would like to speak to items that are not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move ahead. Next order of business is consideration of approval of coastwide cap overage policy. This will be a final action depending on our discussion. And Kirby has a presentation for us. And Kirby, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as mentioned, we're going to go through the draft coastwide cap overage policy today. I have a presentation I'll give you that provides a little bit of background on this policy. We'll review some of the details in the document. I'll answer any questions you guys have, and then it's for the board to consider final action on it. So as background, this board approved Addendum 5 in August of last year. That addendum established a new coastwide cap for the yellow eel fishery. That's at 916,473 pounds. It also established a new management trigger, whereas if landings exceed the cap by 10% or more for 2 years, then it triggers the need for mandatory action to reduce harvest back to the cap. So that 10% overage would get us up to a little over 1 million pounds. The addendum also modified the FMP so there's no longer state allocations. Those states that harvest 1% or more of the coastwide yellow eel landings are responsible for the reduction. Through the rest of my presentation, I'm going to refer to them as the 1% states. Following that approval of Addendum 5, there was a work group that was convened to help develop this coastwide cap overage policy. That work group met 7 times between late last year up through earlier this month. And in talking through this new coastwide cap level and the new management trigger and how to manage the resource in a way that prevents overages from occurring, there were a couple of challenges that came to light pretty quickly. The first is that with the new management trigger, the coastwide cap can be exceeded anywhere between 0% up to 9% for multiple years without there being mandatory board action required. The second challenge is that there is a lag in addressing an overage in a given year due to the timing of when landings data becomes available, right? So we, this year, for example, would receive landings data for 2018. If we wanted to address that, it would take action now, and those measures would likely go into place for 2020. So there's always this lag. The work group considered a number of different overage scenarios and drafted different reduction options and thought through those. So in going through the document now, I want to just highlight some of the key points because it was included in the briefing materials, and hopefully you've all had a chance to review it. But the key distinction the group raised is that with this new approach, the board is trying to manage to the coastwide cap, not the gray area in between above the coastwide cap and under a 10% overage. To do so, this requires proactively monitoring landings data and encouraging voluntary action by states of this board when an overage occurs. To help do that, the work group recommends that there should be a review of preliminary commercial yellow eel landings from ACCSP to be made available annually by the spring meeting. Now, in talking through this approach with the work group members, it became very clear that in order to get that data together in time annually by the spring meeting, it's very important for all states to submit their data on time so that it can go through ACCSP, have a QA/QC analysis done to ensure that they're as accurate as they can be, and the states can then work off of the best available data to respond to changes in landings trends. In terms of how the work group thought through responding to cap overages, they put together this notion that a work group should be convened in those situations to further evaluate the overage, rather than trying to prescribe ahead of time a very specific or maybe narrow approach for dealing with an overage. There could be different situations that arise that need to be evaluated in those instances. So the crux of this policy lays out for years 1 and 2 after an overage has been determined through a decision tree how this management board should respond. To hit home the point about getting data in on time and how important it is for evaluating the yellow eel fishery, we worked with ACCSP to look at the past few years in terms of when states got their landings data in and went through the process of validating them. So I've got 2016, 2017, 2018 up on the screen. You can see that in each of those years, you had some states that got the landings data in on time, and then in other years, you had situations where no states got the landings data in on time. And it fluctuates year to year. So the key take home here, I think, is trying to just keep in mind that if we're going to move forward with an approach where the board is trying to evaluate this data by the spring meeting, it's really going to be contingent on having the data available and in turn submitted on time. Otherwise, this board would be trying to make potential management decisions on data that's not the best that it could be. So next I'm going to go through the decision tree. It's laid out pretty clearly in this document, but I'm going to go through each of the years and each of the branches that are within it, and so it might take a little bit more time, but bear with me. So under year 1, going from left to right on the screen, the first 2 scenarios are pretty straightforward. In a situation where the overage is less than 5%, no action would be taken, but continue to monitor landings annually. In a situation where the landings overage is between 5 and 9.9%, those 1% states that saw an increase in their harvest would be asked to take a voluntary reduction to reduce harvest back to the cap. The furthest column over, those gray boxes, have some added complexity. So it starts off with this question: did the 1% states' landings increase? And there are then 3 potential responses and associated action. If yes, all by 10% or greater, the 1% states would take an equal percentage reduction that would be a voluntary action again to reduce harvest back to the cap. If it's yes, some exceeded or had their landings increased by 10% or greater, and others increased but by less than 10%, the work group is proposing the reduction to be divided up the following way. So all those states that, all those 1% states take 50% of that reduction. And then the other 50% of that reduction goes to those 1% states whose landings increase by 10% or more. So it divides up the reduction into two halves. There's a base level reduction that all of the states that are in the 1% take a reduction, and then the other 50% of it goes to those states that saw their landings increase by 10% or more. For the response in year 2, if there's a 5% to 9.9% overage in year 1, starting from left to right, if there's a greater than 5% overage in year 2 for 1% states whose landings increased in year 1 and 2, the idea would be to expand those voluntary reduction measures and take them into year 3. For 1% states whose landings increased in year 1 but not year 2, the idea would be to maintain those voluntary reductions from year 2 into year 3. For those 1% states whose landings increased in year 2 but did not in year 1, they would then implement voluntary measures in year 3. Moving over in a situation where there's a 0 to 5% overage in year 2, the idea would be to just maintain those voluntary reduction measures from year 2 into 3. And then the third column, if there's an underage in year 2, the idea would be to consider maybe relaxing those measures into year 3. So the last one is what the response would be in year 2 if there's a 10% or greater overage in year 1. So starting again from left to right, if there's a 10% or greater overage in year 2, the idea here would be then to initiate an addendum to determine the best approach for trying to reduce harvest among those states through mandatory action. In the middle column, if that overage in year 2 is 5% to 9.9% in year 2, for the 1% state whose landings increased in year 1 and 2, they would then expand those voluntary measures and taking them into year 3. For the 1% states whose landings increased in year 1 but not year 2, they would maintain voluntary measures into year 3. And for 1% states whose landings increased in year 2 but not in year 1, they would implement voluntary measures in year 3. And in the last column, if there was no overage or less than 5% overage in year 2, they would maintain voluntary measures taken, or voluntary measures would be put into place for year 3. So to really hit home the timetable that would play out under this new policy, if we were looking at this year, and we went back in time to the spring, the board would, if we would go forward into 2020, and the board was looking at landings data from this year, 2019. If there was an overage of 10% or more of the cap, the board would convene, between 0 and 10%, the board would convene a work group. During the summer of next year, the work group would review the overage relative to the decision tree and develop a report with recommended actions for the board to consider. In August of 2020, the board would consider that report and recommend voluntary actions as soon as possible. Voluntary measures implemented would try to be in place before the end of the year. In spring 2021, the board would review 2020 landings, and if it's determined that an overage of greater than 10% of the cap occurred, the management trigger would be tripped. The board would initiate an addendum. Later that summer, we would pull together that draft addendum and we would go through our process of drafting it up, presenting it to this board for consideration at the August meeting. Public comment period would take place in the fall of 2021. In October 2021, the board would consider final action on that addendum and potentially implement the provisions of it by January of 2022. So again, this speaks to the lag in being able to address overages, but this is based on the working group's recommendation, probably the best approach to address overages in the future. So one thing to keep in mind with this policy is we do have preliminary landings data available for 2018. That's why we've got an asterisk next to it. Landings in 2018 for the yellowgill fishery were approximately 781,615 pounds. This value includes landings from Massachusetts, which was not available when the FMP review was completed, so it's slightly higher than what the value is in that document. But this value is an approximate 8% decrease from 2017, and excuse me, it's, I believe, the second lowest value in the time series between 1998 and 2018. So to wrap up, the board today can consider approval of this overage policy. I've tried to outline, I think, the most specific parts of it that are key for this board to keep in mind. And if this board approves this policy today, it would be added to Addendum 5 as an appendix, and that would be modified on our website. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirby. Questions for Kirby? Trying to see.
You got Adam and
Okay, got it.
Emerson.
Okay, we'll start with Adam and then go to Emerson. Adam?
Thank you very much, and thanks to the working group for putting this together. What discussion did the working group have about, if you pull up your example timeline again, the actual feasibility for states to put something in place in August of a given year for that current fishing year, and the expected compliance by fishermen with a voluntary measure?
Yes, thanks for the question. The work group talked about this a little bit, and we have really just one example in recent years. So in 2017, there was, preliminary data indicated that we had gone over the previous coastwide cap. And so the state of Maryland took action to implement changes in their fishery for the fall. We haven't really gone through what each of the states' ability is to quickly implement something because it varies across the coast, right? Some states have to go through a rulemaking process, some have to go through the state legislature. It really varies depending on what state you're talking about. And that's one of the big challenges in trying to move quickly on this. The other is that, keep in mind, this would be voluntary measures that would be implemented. There is no requirement in the addendum currently, nor in this draft policy, that in a situation where an overage occurs and we haven't tripped the management trigger, that management action is required.
Follow?
Thank you for the opportunity for a follow-up. So I would certainly think yesterday's conversation should give us pause about any expectations about voluntary compliance. What would be a potential revised timeline if we did not approve this policy today, but went back to the states to see how feasible this even was on a coast-wide basis, that states could take action given where we are with landings relative to 2018 right now, with this not appearing to be something we would put in place, need to utilize in the short term?
Sorry, Adam, can you repeat that question one more time? I'm a little confused by what we were asking.
If we did not approve this policy today, but took the time to go back to the states and get the answer as to this timeline, if in August of 2020 you were asked to take voluntary action, and get the answer to which of those states actually could do something, what would that do? When would we next consider this as a policy?
Well, I think as Tony mentioned in a previous meeting today, we haven't quite started thinking through what all the boards that will be meeting at the winter meeting. So I'm not sure when the next time this board would meet. It would be kind of at the pleasure of when this board thinks it needs to meet again. But given that this board also has, membership across the coast and all are present here today, we could probably get that answer from all the states around the table if you wanted to know that, ASAP. But I mean, we can, if you prefer, we can go back and send out an email and ask people to respond, and then we could follow up.
Thoughts on that, Adam?
My thought is that I would not vote in favor or approve by consent this policy without knowing those answers.
All right, Emerson Hasbrook.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Emerson. So to answer the first question, yes, I have available, not in a easy to see format, I have the landings data by state. We have a good handle on which states in any given year harvested 1% or more of the coastwide total. So if you're interested in what New York situation would be, I mean, for at least the last 10 years, New York has been a 1% state. They've harvested at least 1% of the coastwide total. To the second question, I might have to turn to my counterpart in ACCSP, Julie, our Deputy Director. She can answer the specific date that we would be asking for this data in 2020.
Hi. The date that is currently slated would be the end of the first week of March. So in this year, in 2019, the date was March 9th, and in 2017, it was March 8th. I do want to point out that when Kirby put up his timeline earlier with lateness, there was sort of that big jump in 2017, and a lot of that came from the fact that that was the first year that we tried to push the deadline a little bit earlier. So in 2016, the deadline, or for the 2016 data, the deadline was March 17th. So when it went from March 17th to March 8th, that's when everyone missed it, and folks are getting better now. But this year's deadline was March 9th, and that timeline is likely to remain in effect for at least a few years at this point.
Follow, Emerson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Julie, thank you for clarifying that. But Kirby, in terms of the landings by state, yes, I already know that New York lands more than 1% of the landings, but I just wanted to get a sense of what the landings distribution is among the states. I know that New York is more than 1, but I don't know what the percentage has been the past couple of years, if it's 5%, 10%, and other states that land a significant percentage of the quota, 25% or more.
So to your follow-up question, over the last 10 years, the states of New York through North Carolina have consistently harvested at least 1% or more of the coastwide total. You were saying you were interested in knowing which states harvested, say, 25% or more of the coastwide total. Is that correct?
Well, it was a two-part question. One is, what's the average percent that New York has been harvesting of the quota? And then, yeah, are there states that harvest a significant amount? And I'm not sure what significant is because I'm not looking at a table that has all the landings in it. So I just picked 25% out of the air. Maybe it's 30%. Maybe it's 65%. You know, whatever some of the states are that have, quote, significant landings.
Yeah, so over the last 10 years, New York has averaged approximately 3.67% of the coastwide total. With the exception of Maryland, there's no other state that's higher than 11% of the coastwide total for the last 10 years.
Lynn Fagley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to maybe try to clarify a little bit to Adam's question about the time by which states could put measures in place. So if we got to the point in August 2020 where the board recommended voluntary measures, so it's my impression that a state could implement measures voluntarily for the next year. And the effect of this voluntary action is to stay ahead of a situation when you would trip a trigger. So if you look at the timeline and we get to August 2020, where it says voluntary measures implemented ASAP for 2020, if a state, and I may be stepping outside the bounds of the document here, I don't know, I hope I'm not, but if a state put those measures in place, if they couldn't do it right away for 2020, but they did it for 2021, then if we fired a trigger, that state would already be ahead of an addendum process. So what the point here is to try to get states on board to take action before it becomes a mandatory addendum. And if they can get ahead of the ball because we have that lag, it's going to save time for reaction. So that was sort of the thought process that we went through in the work group, recognizing that not every state could act within those few months at the end of a year.
Thanks, Lynn, for those thoughts. Also, before we take additional questions, we tried our best to be as inclusive as we could. We had both low harvest states and high harvest states on the work group, and as Kirby mentioned, they put in considerable time, 7 meetings. Most of those meetings ran multiple hours, so it's a complex issue. There was a lot of territory to cover, but the work group did their best. And again, we had geographically a good spectrum from South Carolina to Maine, New Hampshire, low harvest states, and the mid-Atlantic states, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, and North Carolina. Those are those higher harvest states that Kirby referenced were part of this. So we didn't have everybody involved, but we had, I thought, high inclusiveness in terms of developing this policy. So I just want to state that. Any more questions on the policy document for Kirby? Yeah. Maureen.
Thank you. Kirby, this is just something I couldn't follow while you were giving your presentation. On the, oh great, come on computer. When a state exceeds or goes, we have a 1-year overage, on the right-hand column in the gray boxes, if some states exceeded by more than 10% and some states exceeded by less than 10%, that's the bigger box. It says that each 1% state takes a base voluntary reduction equal to 50% of the reduction needed to get to the cap. Are we talking about a standard number of pounds that represent the 50%? And each state would take an equal number of poundage from it? Or is that poundage going to be a percent of the state's landings?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good one. I think my read of it is that it would be dependent on the volume of landings, right? So I believe it would be somewhere in the ballpark if we had like 100,000 pounds and you have 50,000 pounds that needs to be reduced. That's the base reduction that the 1% states have to take, right? They got to get to that reduced by 50,000 pounds collectively. The other 50,000 pounds would then be dealt with by those states that are harvesting 10% or more, or saw an increase in their harvest by 10% or more. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I think what I'm asking is for the first group, is it going to be a set poundage that each state will have to take, or is it going to be a percent of it?
I think that would have to be determined at the time. This decision tree doesn't specify whether it would be a percentage or a poundage on that front.
So it would be determined at the time if we were to have the overage. Thank you.
Additional questions for Kirby? Chris?
If, in the decision tree, if the states don't report or all the states don't report, is the default to do an addendum to address the overages? So do you have to have all the states reporting to be able to even move forward with option, the decision trees?
I think, trying to understand the question, yes, we need all states to report their landings. I mean, that allows us to evaluate whether the coastwide cap has been exceeded or not.
So then what is the default if they don't?
If the states don't report their landings?
Right, by the deadline.
Sorry, by the deadline or annually? I'm not understanding.
It seems like you have to meet a specific time for the information to get put into the process in time to be effective to actually move forward, correct? And I'm just trying to picture if they don't, or if one or two states don't report, what happens then? What's the default in either year 1 or 2? How do you actually, do you have to catch up? I don't know.
Well, the key thing I would point out with this policy is that the working group recommended the spring meeting so as to, as quickly as possible, try to implement voluntary measures if needed for that year. And so that's part of why that deadline is important. So if the data isn't available by the spring meeting, then when that data is available, we would report it out to the board. It would just generally delay the process in this board being able to take action.
Tony?
And to the point, it's to the benefit of the states. It's for their own well-being in terms of their eel fisheries, because no one wants to exceed the cap. And so therefore, these voluntary measures are to prevent the trigger from being hit. It's not an individual state is exceeding, it's the coastwide quota being exceeded. And so everybody is holding each other accountable.
Thank you, Tony, for the clarification. Time for a couple more questions, but just to let the board know, there's 3 possible outcomes today. If the board supports moving forward with this policy without any edits, then we can accept it, a motion to do so. If there are very minor edits, we could also do that today. But if there are significant concerns by the board, we'd have to come back to the working group, and that would delay the process. So just make you know that, make you aware of that. Any other questions? I have time for a couple more, if you have them. Emerson, one last.
Yeah, if nobody else has a question, I still have a couple. Is it possible, under that box that Maureen was referring to, right, on the right-hand side of year 1, the larger box, yes, somebody greater than 10%. Under that scenario, depending on what the overage is it possible that by spreading that 50% across all the 1% states, that a state may take a reduction that's approximately equivalent to what its current harvest is?
I'd have to look at the data, but I don't believe that would be the case given where the cap's at, what the overage scenarios could be. I mean, Yeah, I'd have to double check, but yeah.
One last one, Lynn Figley.
I don't have a question, Mr. Chair. I have a comment, if that's okay. Yeah, and to Emerson's point, so I just want to remind the board that the point to this was to try to develop an alternate scenario than developing a hard allocation that a state would be saddled with and getting in a situation of creating winners and losers on allocation. So the idea here is to be flexible and if we have to make a reduction, to be able to, and it's stated in the document, to carefully review the pattern and the magnitude of the overage in determining how to get back to the cap. And so that means if you have situations where some states are really shooting up and other states aren't, you can make a reduction to get back to the cap, recognizing that it is not a permanent allocation that we're going to be saddled with onto the future. The actions are voluntary, so we're all holding together and trying to, as Tony said, hold each other accountable, recognizing that if we exceed the trigger and we do 2 years of 10% overage, then it's going to be an addendum and it's no longer going to be voluntary. Then we're going to have to determine how to get to that reduction. So it's a little bit of a different way to do business. The work group made a very conscious decision, to your point, Emerson, not to be overly prescriptive, because when we get in this situation is when the work group is going to have to convene and really see how these decision trees are going to come together, and Emerson, make sure that the scenario that you outlined doesn't happen.
Thank you, Lynn. At this point in time, I'd entertain a motion. Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one point. Of course, if you looked at a 3-year scenario, when you got to the end of year 3, year 1 would drop out, and then you'd have a different set of numbers for 2 years, right? Okay. Well, with that being said, you want to entertain a motion, Mr. Chairman? I've got a 3-page motion in honor of my good friend Dr. Pierce, but I think it's been edited down to something a little bit more reasonable, so I think you have it. There it is. So, move to approve the coastwide cap overage policy as presented today.
Do we have a second? Sheree Patterson.
So, I
start off and see if this can go the easy way. Is there an objection to this motion? We do have an objection, so this is a final action, so it will be a roll call vote. Is there a need to caucus? There's, let's say, about a 2-minute caucus. Okay, we'll go ahead and read the motion into the record, and then Kirby will conduct the roll call vote. Move to approve the coastwide cap overage policy as presented today. The motion made by Mr. Reed, seconded by Ms. Patterson. And Kirby, could you go ahead and conduct the roll call?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with the state of Maine.
No.
New Hampshire.
Yes.
Massachusetts.
Yes.
Rhode Island.
Yes.
Connecticut.
Yes.
New York.
Yes.
New Jersey.
No.
Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Delaware.
Yes.
Maryland.
Yes.
District of Columbia is not present. Potomac River Fisheries Commission.
Yes.
Virginia.
Yes.
North Carolina.
Yes.
South Carolina.
Yes.
Georgia.
Yes.
Florida.
Yes.
National Marine Fisheries Service.
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yes.
The motion passes 16 in favor, 2 opposed, no abstentions, and no null votes. Thank you. Our next item up on the agenda is consideration approval of 2019 Fishery Management Plan Review and State Compliance Reports. Kirby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll go through this F&P review now. I just have an outline for you all, a review status of the stock, status of the fishery, state compliance with the F&P and PRT recommendations. So, as we've discussed before, Addendum 5 was approved in 2018. 2 aquaculture proposals were submitted and approved for the 2019 season. Any state harvesting over 750 pounds of glass eel a year must implement a fishery independent life cycle survey. Maine began implementing their survey in 2016. As the board may remember, there was an update provided at the August meeting last year. They have continued to work on adjusting some of the issues they've encountered with the site selection for a few of those different life stage data points. In terms of stock status, as this board's aware, the American eel stock status remains depleted. We have no reference points we're working under. In terms of the status of the commercial fishery, state-reported landings for the yellow silver eels was approximately 780,615 pounds in 2018. As mentioned in my previous presentation, that's approximately an 8% decrease from 2017 to 2018. Delaware, Maryland, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, and Virginia account for 82% of the harvest. Landings of glass eel were reported from Maine and South Carolina. Maine harvested 9,194 pounds. South Carolina's landings are confidential. In terms of status of the fishery for the recreational sector, since 2009, recreational data has not been included as part of compliance reports, given the unreliable nature of the MRIP survey design and targeting eel. In reviewing the plan, there were no changes to eel measures in 2018. There was no noted issues in terms of eel regulations from glass eel regulations for Maine or South Carolina. In terms of the yellow eel fishery regulations, as we've noted before, the coastwide cap was increased to 916,000 pounds through Addendum 5. There's now a 2-year management trigger, and state-by-state quotas have been removed. There was no noted issues in terms of yellow eel regulations from state compliance reports. In terms of the silver eel fishery, there were no new changes in regulations. As noted, we didn't find any issues with state compliance reports there. And as part of Addendum 5, aquaculture plan proposals, based on the technical committee's recommendations, additional information is requested from the states as part of those proposals annually. So that was modified based on the board's approval of Addendum 5. The only other issue that was noted but has been rectified is that we didn't receive a compliance report from Massachusetts by the time we had compiled the F&P review for this meeting, but we received it within the last week. In terms of de minimis status, the F&P stipulates that states may apply for de minimis status for each of the life stages of eel that they are targeting for the preceding 2 years if their average commercial landings constitute less than 1% of the coastwide commercial landings. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida requested de minimis status for the yellow eel fishery, and they all met that threshold. South Carolina requested de minimis status for glass eels and met that as well. In terms of plan review team recommendations, The PRT recommends that the board consider state compliance as mentioned. We had some standing items that were brought up last year, such as reconsidering the requirement that states provide an estimate of the percent of harvest that goes to food versus bait. This is a challenging estimate for the states to put together in terms of information and compliance reports. There was the note that states should work with law enforcement agencies to include information on illegal or undocumented harvest of eels. The PRT also requested that New York continue to try to work to separate out their yellow and silver eel landings where possible, and that states should try to continue to quantify where possible when upstream and downstream passage has been improved and provide that information to the technical committee for evaluation. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Questions for Kirby? John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you just elaborate a little more on Maine's life cycle survey and why that seems to still be not making a lot of progress?
So yeah, sorry. In terms of characterizing it, they have made progress. It was first implemented in 2016, as I noted. They, at the board meeting in August of last year, they presented some of their preliminary information as part of the technical committee report. They have been adjusting some of the sites that they were using over time, and I think that's just in an effort to capture the best data available. But we can provide you more information specific to what their estimates were if you want. It's also included in the state compliance reports that are compiled in the back.
Additional questions for Kirby? Barring none, we'll entertain a motion.
You got
Cherie Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Move to accept the FMP review and state compliance reports for American eel and de minimis requests for New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Florida requested de minimis status for their yellow eel fisheries and de minimis status for both South Carolina's yellow eel and glass fisheries, as well as, and glass fisheries, yeah. Glass eel fisheries, good. And accept and forward the PRT's recommendations.
Thank you, Cherie. Do we have a second to that motion? Lynn Fagley. Is there any objection to this motion? Seeing none, motion passes. Next up, is there any other business to bring before this board?
You got it, Dennis.
Dennis Abbott.
Before we adjourn, I do have an announcement to make, if you recognize me.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Dennis.
Yes, I just wanted to remind everyone that there are still T-shirts available. If you've bought your $20 T-shirt, you can buy another one for $10, give you a chance at the raffle. All the items that principally Richie White collected from LL Bean, Kittery Trading Post, CCA will all be raffled off tomorrow at lunchtime. So for a good cause, we urge you to get out there and buy another T-shirt. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. So I think that concludes the business of this board. This concludes my tenure for chairman, and I'll be turning over the reins for the next meeting to the very capable hands of Ms. Lynn Fagley of Maryland. And thank you for the privilege of chairing this board. We're adjourned. Thank you.